I, for better or worse, when .NET Rocks, we got involved with NDC literally from the very first show, which was not in downtown Oslo. So I met Jacob a couple of years in when he started working for the conference and became a partner and has been a part of it ever since. So for better or worse, I've been doing conferences for a really long time. It's good to see a bunch of different shows. So if you haven't run across me before, my name is Richard Campbell. I make podcasts and a bunch of other stuff. You can usually find me on Twitter. I wrote my first line of code in 1977, which is not the most important thing to happen in 1977. The most important thing to happen in 1977 is Star Wars, right? Focus on priorities. Of course, computers were a little bit different back then. My first machine was a TRS-80 Model 1. It had 4K of RAM, a cassette tape player to store programs on. The graphical screen resolution was 127 by 47. And it had a version of BASIC not made by Microsoft. It was actually a tiny BASIC because it was only 4K of RAM. And that tiny BASIC had 3 error messages. What? How? And sorry. Divide 1 by 0. Sorry. I think it's the best error message going, really. I mean, what is object not found, but sorry. And I make a lot of podcasts. So my friend Carl Franklin started .NET Rocks back in 2002. The 20th anniversary of .NET Rocks will be this August. And on this stage tomorrow, we will record episode 1800. So I hope you'll come for that. We've got Heather Downing as our guest, and we're going to have some fun with it. But the 00 shows are astonishing. We did not start with Carl at the very beginning. I came on later. I was a guest in the first 100, and I became co-host as of episode 100. So now we're at 1800. So I've been around for a while, but didn't go from the beginning. I also make an IT-related podcast called Run As Radio, which is just exercising the other half of my brain. And I'll talk a little bit about this in the history too, but that tablet show was an interval for us because we made a show called .NET Rocks, and there was a time around 2011 when we weren't so sure if .NET rocked. So this was our backup show. It's been a long road, friends. You know, I'm talking about 20 years of history now, and it shocks me to assemble that storyline and realize all the things I've seen and been through, and you know, even before that. You know, if you look at hardware from 2002, the big innovation on the PC side was we actually had black cases, not beige cases. Right? That we'd made progress at that point. Although HDMI still really wasn't a thing. Those were VGA displays and DVI displays back then. But even then, Apple made the most gorgeous machines. This G4, that came out in 2002. It was a PowerPC-based machine, so which they would eventually move away from. But at the time, it was just so much nicer than anybody else. And the top selling phone in 2002 was the Nokia 1200. So, and this, you know, I had one of the variants of this. This is back when you got your text messages one at a time, right? And you literally had to say, oh, I have a text message, read text message. It would show you the text. You could choose to reply to it or delete it. Then it would show you the next message. So I wrote a script for some server management software that would actually, I'd gotten an access to the API through the telco to send me a text message when the server had a problem. Anyway, I had a bug. 32,767 text messages later, one at a time. So when I realize what I've done, I call the telco, right? And you get your tier 1 tech support. They ask me if I'll turn it off and turn it back on again, like that kind of thing. Pretty quickly scare that person. They put me up to tier 2. Tier 2 is now frustrated and confused with me, finally puts me through to tier 3. I've now been on the phone for half an hour. I get to tier 3, he says, hi, my phone number is da-da-da-da, and the guy says, oh, it's you. Yeah, says, that's a lot of text messages. You know, they're 50 cents each, right? I'm like, yeah. I'm more worried about deleting them all. So I'll do this on my end. You'll have to delete one. Don't do that again. Before rate-limited APIs, you know, not the thing. I mean, the hardware is interesting, but also to remember that in 2002, the dot-com bubble had just burst. So the internet had gone to become a publicly visible entity, been around since the 1970s, but now it was a public entity in 1995, and that kicked off this insanity that spent a tremendous amount of money, and it all slammed to a stop by 2002. for better or worse, right? It was a big shakeup. We sort of had to restructure. And so priorities were shifting around. Every time you have a bubble like this, a lot of money gets spent, much of it unwisely. And now you sort of you have to back off and rethink it. And we're kind of in one of those periods right now. Just the pandemic has squeezed a bunch of things. Most of us were pretty busy through this, but now you're starting to see some more focus on return on investment and value. This was what was happening in 2002 as well. There was Google, but Google was not the most popular search engine. Google was number 3 in 2002. Who was number 2? Any guesses? It was Yahoo, which really begs the question, who the heck was number 1 in 2002? It was MSN Search. Why? Why was MSN Search the number 1 search engine in 2002? IE6. IE6 had only come out the year before. It was with XP, and XP represented the most dominant operating system on the planet. Nobody knew at the time, because it was only downhill from here for Windows, right? But XP was 90+%. And most people they thought the internet was that little E icon, right? My internet's not working, right? And their address bar had been replaced by something. But yeah, and they didn't know about search. You just typed into the address bar, and that defaulted MSN Search, and so MSN Search dominated. Not for much longer. You know, by a couple of years, Google will take it over, and it's kept it ever since. But again, different time. The beginning of 2002, Bill Gates published an internal letter to Microsoft called Trustworthy Computing. Because 2001 had been the Anna Kournikova virus, and NIMDA1, and SQL Slammer, and all these exploits that were all, I mean, they were actually kind of fun hacks, because they were just propagators. You know, 20 years on, we live in a far more weaponized world on the internet. But this was the beginning of Microsoft taking security very seriously. This is what kicks off what will become XP Service Pack 2 and all of the problems that'll create. But also Microsoft building what I would argue is still the definitive security team on the internet. I don't think they're as good as they were a few years ago. They're kind of a little sloppy these days. But the practice of actually taking internet security seriously starts here in a lot of respects with Bill's memo. I would also point out, Bill is not CEO at this point. He stepped down in 2000. So this entire 20 years I'm talking about, Bill is not the leader at Microsoft. He's the chief architect for a few years, then he goes off to cure malaria, and now he's sort of around again, but different role. And of course, if you come from the .NET world, you know that 2002 was when we got the first version of .NET in February. So that was C#1, because they weren't allowed to make Java anymore. And also, the whole pitch of Visual Studio .NET at this time, there had been 2 versions of Studio before this that were, the first one was named 97, and the second one was named 6, because numbers are hard. And now it was called .NET. And at the time, Java was any platform, one language. And so Microsoft's pitch for .NET was 22 languages, one platform. Try and name 22 languages from 2002. There was an Eiffel.NET and an OCaml.NET, as well as the ones you know, the C#, the VBs, and so forth. This is before F#. F# will come later, but you know, that's the beginning of the move on .NET. And of course, we got active server pages, the ASP.NET version, which was really a tool built for Windows developers to learn how to build web pages by not building web pages. All right, by concealing everything that was webby from you. It was very productive, but as the number of users went up, issues emerged. And so, you know, we drove a whole lot of people there. The last sort of death throes of Netscape are happening, and it becomes the Mozilla Foundation, and the first version of Firefox comes out now. And it will grow. It'll be a very successful browser. It'll peak around 2009, which is around the time that Chrome shows up. So this is before Chrome. You know, people are using IE for a reason. The first version of Safari won't show up till the next year, 2003. You'll have Safari on the Mac, because we're before all of those things. So we're doing client-server development primarily. .NET is very young, so it's not very robust. It's leaking a fair bit of memory and so forth. As long as it's a desktop app you're building and you can reboot regularly, you're good. But Microsoft, in their efforts to cooperate with the US government, their consent decree, are being more public, more open around making software. And so one of the things they do is they publish ECMA specifications for C# and for the runtime. And a young man by the name of Miguel de Icaza, back in 2002, and this is actually a picture from the conference in 2001, where he announced the Mono project. So Miguel had been working on IDEs for Linux for a long time. And now he read through the specification, he goes, this is a pretty cool language. I like this. And so he gathered up some friends, open source project, to build an implementation of .NET that will run on Linux, which is the Mono project. It'll take him a few years to get to the first version. It'll be 2004, when the first bits are sort of out there, very much equivalent of .NET 1.1. And he puts himself in this insane world where the Microsoft people are very leery of him because he's a Linux guy, right? And Steve Ballmer told us Linux is a cancer. And the Linux people are all looking at him like, I don't know about that guy. He works with Microsoft stuff. That's weird. So it was kind of an everybody hates Miguel era. But he becomes incredibly important in this story over time because the world's still evolving, right? These early few years, we're trying to get to interoperability. We're trying to work between different environments. This is where the WS Star standards start to emerge. And we're looking for a better way to do web development. And because web development's pretty rough at that time. You know, Dreamweaver was the highlight, but you also needed front page extensions, and that's not great. And that's when David Heinemann Hansen first came out with Rails. So he took the language Ruby, which had been around for years and was an interesting dynamic language, but he added in the scaffolding engine, pointed at a database, scaffolds the initial architecture, you can iterate really rapidly. And combined with a dynamic language, very fun development environment, and it takes off like a shot. But it also is a demonstration of the power of open source at the time. Again, just before GitHub and all those sorts of things, you know, this is on SourceForge, but it's easy for people to make improvements to it. A bunch of contributors working together to make better and better software. And that's interesting. We're seeing a different layer of what the internet can do for us. You know, the .com boom had been this initial, hey, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Right? You can interact with anyone, you can share information quickly, you can distribute software relatively efficiently as long as it's small, because dial-up. But here we were starting to see the first real signs of collaboration in code. And it's one of the things that accelerated Rails, was its ability for us to share ideas in code with each other. We still need a long way to go, but this is where it begins, and it starts to change the way we as developers work. The first iteration of Amazon Web Services actually goes all the way back to 2002. And Amazon's goal at that time was to allow third-party vendors to sell on the Amazon site. And they wanted them to pay for the infrastructure they were going to run on. It was all a way to squeeze more money out of vendors. And this is Amazon. That's what they do. By 2006, they're doing the third restart of it. And it has S3, the SQS and EC2 and the Elastic Cloud Compute. But they have the essentials of what is cloud computing. Most of us barely understand it. We think it's kind of vaguely interesting. It's like virtualization but weird. But, you know, it's progress. Also in 2006, Microsoft, recognizing that they don't understand the web developers, start making a conference for web developers. It was called Mix, which is a great name. This is a great graphic. You notice it looks really nice, which normally you wouldn't get from a 2006 graphic, because the original version of this was 320 by 200. And I was very frustrated with how bad it looks on a 1080 screen, so I actually paid a designer to recreate the logo for me in high res. I have the only good-looking version of the Mix 06 logo. You can't have it. But some important things happen at Mix. This is where Microsoft finally gets back on the bandwagon making a new browser. IE7 is announced here and released. And it's been 5 years since IE6. So it had been a long time. They also hint at a thing called WPFE, but we'll talk about that later. Microsoft's also moving towards open source by creating their own SourceForge, Codeplex. This is a graphic I didn't have recreated. Okay. See the difference. 2006 graphics are not pretty. This one is pretty because I paid money, right? This one is not pretty. Most people remember if you remember Codeplex from back then, you remember it for one thing, the Ajax toolkit. That was one of the first things that landed on Codeplex. And the Ajax toolkit, I mean, talk about making stuff by accident. So Microsoft started making their own big mail server, Exchange server. An Exchange server they wanted to have, they'd been told to make web components to make the mail work on a web client, not just Outlook. So they're working on Outlook Web Access, OWA. But they really wanted that you've got mail thing to work, and they couldn't figure out a way to do it. So they went to the IE team and said, listen, can you add an ability to basically push an XML payload back down to the browser? Just meet an XML request. And that's what you can do when you're a giant company like that, where the guys are literally down the hall. And so in IE6, they added XML HTTP requests. No standards, no plan, no nothing. They just did it so that it could go bing when you got mail in OWA. That was the point. But that leads to this whole concept of Ajax, of this ability of partially loading pages. So it wasn't anybody's intent, it just was an emergent property of a request in IE that everyone adopted. So starting back with Exchange 5.5. So that's the good news in 2006. Let's talk about the bad news in 2006. What went wrong? I mean, the problem with XP being so dominant was that they really had no competitors at this point. They could do anything. And so they tried, which was a mistake. The code name for XP was Whistler, which is a ski town not far from where I live in British Columbia. And so the next version of Windows after Whistler was going to be named for the mountain beside Whistler, a mountain called Blackcomb. But this is also when Bill Gates is now chief architect, and he has entirely too much time on his hands. And so there's a big push for a 100% object-oriented operating system. Well, it's like only something a true believer could necessarily want. And the original specifications for Blackcomb were so outrageous that everybody's like, oh, let's dial that thing back. Like, we got to take a breath and do something a little simpler. And so they made an interim project, because between the mountain of Whistler and the mountain of Blackcomb is a very large bar called the Longhorn Bar. And so in 2004, they announced Longhorn, which was the interim project. And Longhorn went through some nasty iterations to eventually become Vista, and also generate a new version of .NET called .NET 3, which was catching all the stuff that got pushed out of Windows. And so by 2007, we've made a little bit of progress. Hardware's evolved a bit. You see, we've gone beyond the black PC. Now you can have red and silver shiny PCs. These are the Dell XPSs. It's actually been a really fun thing for me in collecting this whole story to look at how XPSs from Dell changed. Bigger, smaller, right? This is Pentium era. That thing, you can heat a room with it. Like it kicks out a lot of heat. It's like, just turn on Quake full res. You can warm up the room, no problem. The Mac is now also on the Intel chipset, and again, the prettiest machine made anywhere. And the #1 selling phone is still a Nokia, although it's 2007, so you know it's coming. This thing. It's important to remember that this phone was not that impressive. This was a 2G phone in a 3G era. And as Steve Jobs said, if you're going to program for the iPhone, you're going to program in Safari. Because he could see HTML5 was coming, and he figured that was the way things were going to go forward. He was wrong. I mean, HTML5 did show up, but hackers are smarter than he is, and they jailbroke the phone and started making their own apps. And he was forced to release the internal tools and create the App Store, essentially, to manage all of that. And that's why those tools were so bad. Because they were, Cocoa and Xcode, they were only meant to be used internally. They were never meant to be for public consumption, right? For developer consumption. But we've definitely shaken things up. And this is kind of the end of the phone. Because before this, before the iPhone, phones were fun, right? You could get keyboards, you could get slide out, there were pop-ups, there were add-ons. After the iPhone, all the phones are the same, right? It's just a slab of black glass, slab of black glass, slab of black glass. But it is changing civilization. Right? What we don't know at that time in 2007 is every adult human in the world is going to have one of these ultimately. Right? That we are all becoming cyborgs. We have digital extensions to ourselves. You know perfectly well. You know how upset you are when you leave the phone in the bathroom. But that's a very fundamental change to society. Right? Now, I mean, most of the time when you think about cyborgs, you think about implants, but A, ew, and B, slows down upgrades. Why would you do that? It's another one to get. Can't keep taking it in and out. So it also tears up software development. Because largely for the first time ever, the majority of people using your code aren't running on the kind of device you wrote it on. Your dev cycle is much more difficult now. and it's still hard. But previous to the smartphone revolution, we generally worked on the same kind of machine that the person consuming our software would run it on. And so your cycle was shorter. You could run it and have a more or less equivalent experience to what your user would have. And as phones became dominant, that ends, and we struggle. It's hard to build for a different device. Even when you got it tuned, the chain is longer. I've got to push that device, evaluate it from there, push it back. And then you have the drawer of broken dreams, right? The drawer of broken dreams is filled with smartphones. You start with the most popular smartphone, whatever that phone may be at the time. Maybe it's the iPhone, maybe it's one of the Galaxies, whatever it may be. You make your app look great on that phone. And then when it looks great on that phone, you go to the drawer of broken dreams and you take out the next phone. And it doesn't look quite right on that phone. So now you tweak it and tune it, make it look good on that phone. Now you have to regress it to the previous phone, see how that looks. And you can get them both working. You go back to the drawer of broken dreams. And there's 100 phones in the drawer of broken dreams. So the impact of smartphone development really shook us up. It took a long time to get better at this. And I would argue we're still on this cycle. This cycle starts in 2007. Largely we're doing native development. Web development will come a little bit later, but we've had more than a decade of battling this complex cycle. And I think we're getting better. The tooling is improving, but it's a struggle. The first version of Silverlight appears in 2007 as well. Now, Silverlight originally was WPFE, or Windows Presentation Foundation Everywhere, okay? And we did this show on .NET Rocks, because WPFE was like the worst code name ever. And Brad Abrams, the guy who was leading the project at the time, says, listen, if we have a cool code name, like Avalon, we get a lousy product name, like Windows Presentation Foundation. So we're starting with a bad code name, because then we get a good product name. And if you ever wonder where the word Silverlight comes from, I mean, the original version of Silverlight in 2007 had nothing to do with .NET whatsoever. It was scripted in JavaScript, and it was actually made for the media streaming services for IIS. So this, again, is at the beginning of streaming video and being able to do variable speed streaming. So reduce resolution to decrease bandwidth consumption and be able to stage back up again. So you need a client on the front end that can understand what speed we have available to us and adjust the stream as necessary. This is what Netflix depended on. Before this, Netflix shipped out DVDs in red envelopes. After this, they start being the streaming service that became a monster. But there's other parts that are important to Silverlight and the change the way Microsoft's working as well. The name Silverlight does exist elsewhere. Microsoft didn't invent the word. It actually comes from photography. Do you remember those old instant cameras with the rotating cubes for taking pictures, and every time you'd fire it, it was like a one shot, and then it would rotate and take it again? So that flash process leaves behind debris inside of the flash bulb. That's Silverlight, because Silverlight is what comes after flash. And I haven't talked about Flash up to this point, because Flash is several years old already, right? And ActionScript actually came in 2000, with beginnings of trying to come more sophisticated scripting for the internet, right? And it leads to, great technologies like Homestar Runner. But Silverlight was another approach to this. And of course, it will pick up .NET, but initially it doesn't have it in there. But Microsoft also wants to get out of band. They're used to making products that ship with Studio. And Studio ships every 18 to 24 months. And watching the open source community iterate rapidly on tools like Rails makes them realize, like, we're just moving too slowly. So Silverlight initially never shipped in the box. In fact, for 3 years, they'll push out versions all through Codeplex to be able to rapidly iterate. They'll incorporate .NET 3. They'll bring in Mac support, a version of CLR running in the Mac, all in that short amount of time. And that also on Codeplex will be MVC. So MVC, again, was very much a response to Rails. It was an idea of, can we get away from web forms? Can we build testable, scalable web pages? Well, what would that look like? And you may have heard at some point this apocryphal story of the MVC being invented by Scott Guthrie on the way to a conference. It's not true. It's a good story, though. But it was developed internally. And Scott Guthrie, who led the web team at the time, did reach out to groups of people that were strong in the open source community and leveraged MVC as a way to hire them in. In fact, well, I know at least one of them is here, may not be in the room right now, but folks we called them on .NET Rocks, we called them Scott Guthrie's Ninja Army. Scott Hanselman, Rob Connery, Phil Hack, Glenn Block, all folks with strong open source backgrounds, all got brought in around MVC. Now, at the time, there was a movement around Microsoft development using more open source. These folks were vociferous, is a polite term, but they called themselves alt.net. And what they were really presenting was an idea that open source should be part of the .NET development experience. That a lot of folks were just expecting Microsoft to provide you with everything you needed. You know, the normal way to do development in 2008, 2007 was you paid for your MSDN subscription and you paid for a control suite. Maybe Telerik, maybe DevX, maybe Component One, like there was a bunch of them, but you pick one and your MSDN, that's all you use. And so the idea that you would also use open source was strange at the time. And these were folks that were open source maintainers and were advocating for that entire movement. It's largely gone away now, although it's all come true. Open source is a fundamental part of things, but at the time they were pushing on something that most folks thought were odd. Of course, that MVC thing turns into a set of books. So there's the all very much younger group of troublemakers, and they ran nerd dinners around this. But that's a beginning of a cadre inside of Microsoft that are very pro-open source and are trying to do, because web development requires it. And they already recognized that was an essential part of the equation. By 2008, we get our first version of Chrome, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. Eric Schmidt admitted that they stayed out of the browser wars. The squabble between Internet Explorer and Mozilla and Safari just seemed like something to stay clear of. But as it started to calm down, along came Chrome. They'd had it around for a few years internally, but we got it publicly in 2008. Also, the Google App Engine comes at this time, too. This will eventually become the Google Cloud product, but in 2008, pretty much announced alongside Chrome was, hey, if you want to run code on our servers, we can do that for you. Right? We'll let that work. And it'll be in preview for a while. They won't actually call it Google GCP until 2011. So it's only like a 3-year beta. I mean, faster than Gmail, but it was a long gestation period. By 2008, we're also going after IE6. Interestingly enough, DHH, the guy behind Ruby on Rails, now he'd been making and continues to make a product called Basecamp, one of the sort of definitive project management tools. We used originally email-based and lots of web components way before most other folks. He was very much on the leading edge of this. And he was the one who wrote in 2007, he said, or in 2008, he says, listen, I am tired of making a web page for browsers and then another one for IE6. So I'm not going to do it anymore. If you try and go to my site, you're trying to use Basecamp with IE6, I'm literally going to tell you, go get a real browser. And it catches on. Like more, and then there was a group of sites in Norway, it was a bunch of different sites that just started. When you came to that website in IE6, a box popped up that said, listen, you need a real browser. Now, why was IE6 so evil? Well, it had the classic combination of being very popular and not compliant with standards, right? They shipped IE6 in August of 2001. CSS1 wasn't ratified yet. So they did an implementation of CSS based on 0.8 that was different from anything else. So it just misbehaved. You literally had to write if IE6 code to make this page behave. This sounds very familiar, right? It's like Safari has become the new IE6. Very popular, not compliant with standards. And so you end up having to code for it. But then eventually, most Microsoft people too are saying, listen, like we have IE7 and IE8, you can let IE6 go. Like it's okay. And so it was a very deliberate, active push to end IE6. It wasn't a simple thing to do. And so by 2008, we get Silverlight now has .NET in it, and it now becomes this interesting development tool where I can now push .NET code, C# code, onto a Mac, and it'll work inside of a browser. All right, it's all plug-in driven. And I'd be remiss not to talk a little bit about JavaScript in 2008. Doug Crockford, who's spoken at this show in the past, wrote a book called JavaScript: The Good Parts. It's a really thin book. But what Doug was talking about was, look, there's a language in here, right? This was a scripting tool built to provide extensibility to browsers. But there's a language in there somewhere. We just have to disentangle it from the DOM. And it was an inspiration. When you talk to folks doing modern tooling for JavaScript, this is the book that kind of kicks all this off. This JavaScript needs to grow up, needs to be a real thing. Because the W3C is struggling mightily this time. And we're living in DHTML land, and it's not fun. And we've spent some time with XHTML, and we know that's a mistake. Turns out not everything Tim Berners-Lee likes is right. But this was a sort of an anchoring point for thinking going forward. Also in the time period, Ray Ozzie, who's taken over for Bill Gates as chief architect, announces Windows Azure. So this is Microsoft's cloud response. The architect behind it was a guy named Abhishek, brilliant guy. And as is typical of very, very smart people, they tend to jump to the end game. So the original offering from Azure was going to be the web role and the app role. Like, he basically described serverless before any of us wanted it. And so we didn't buy it. But those first few years of Azure are tough. But it gets announced back at PDC in 07. Roughly around the same time, we see Sun Microsystems in big trouble trying to find financing and ultimately gets acquired by Oracle. And I haven't talked about Java at all at this time, but Java had been around since the 90s. It really brought the idea of the managed runtime to modern development. They tried various cloud solutions. They had some interesting choices on how they did things. They wanted to be open source. They definitely had the pioneer syndrome. The idea being, the problem with being a pioneer is you get arrows in your back. And so the folks that come afterwards get to learn from your mistakes and in some cases outrun you. Not that you can argue with the install base in Java. And living in Oracle, that's a whole other can of worms. And for a few years, it looked pretty bleak, although it seems like the Oracle folks have kind of figured out what it takes to run a development environment in a meaningful way. So when I talk to Java people these days, they're not that frustrated. It's just like, it's a slow, big machine. But it's a mature language and a mature platform that now has multiple languages running on it, right? Turns out runtimes can run anything you want. Microsoft finally cleans up their act on Windows with Windows 7 in 2009. For better or worse, for many people, still a favorite version of Windows. Don't tell anybody it's actually, Vista with some dressing redone on it. They fixed some problems back there. And we do get the shipped version of Azure doesn't come until 2010. And that ships with SQL Azure, .NET, Java, and PHP. That's what the originals have. But we don't remember any of that because this thing comes out. The big iPhone. Why is it so disruptive? Well, on the hardware side, we'd been racing for the $500 laptop for a while. And when you got laptops that cheap, they were terrible. They're all plastic, fragile, stripped down, barely functional, thick, ugly machines. And then for $800, this svelte little tablet came along that was beautiful and lean, and battery life was amazing, so forth. So it basically destroyed the cheap laptop. It took that market out. And laptops would come back, but they'd come back at $1,200 or $1,500. And so for that, you could make a nice laptop. So in some ways, this also saved the laptop. But it also put paid to the M-dots, to making separate mobile pages. Up until now, you could get away with, as a developer, you built your regular website or you built your regular app, and then you did something for the phone. m.yourdomain.com. You're not going to do T. That's one too many, right? We'll do 2, but 3, now it's crazy talk. CSS media queries had been around in the specification now since CSS1. Nobody took them seriously except Audi for some reason. Like, if you go to the Audi.com site, you can go back into the Wayback Machine, and you can look in 2005, the Audi.com site is responsive. You can shrink it down and it'll reorganize itself. It is astonishing. Before everybody, Audi. But the tablet really now forced us to all think in terms of, you are going to have multiple form factors. The problem with this device, CTOs like it. The guy you can't really say no to, I was doing work in IT back then, and the CTO would show up and goes, I'll be using this, figure it out. It didn't destroy the world entirely. It certainly sent Microsoft into a tailspin, because Microsoft now had to focus on, how do we respond to this? And this is what will lead to Windows 8, for better or worse. But this is March of 2010. In April of 2010, Studio 2010 ships. Now, this was a marquee version of Studio. This was a breakthrough edition. This was all of the cleanup from Vista done. We have a new version of the runtime. We now have option to compile to 64-bit, or the default is compile any, which really means compile 32, because if you compile 64, it just means the software doesn't work. We also get F#, a brand new language in .NET. Astonishing, fantastic, thinking functionally in there. We get Silverlight 4. So very first version was 2007. They've now gone through 4 versions and got it into the box in less than 3 years. It runs out of browser. Microsoft presents it as their definitive approach to enterprise development. This is how you should be building software, because it runs on all the platforms inside of your office. It's going to be great. This is what you should do. Also, in the box, jQuery. Under the MIT license. So John Resig started it back in 2006. Microsoft, working on MVC, we're using Coplex for it. So it's not open source development the way we think of it today, but what they would do is they build internally a version, they call it a preview, they push it to Coplex. We could download it, play with it, and then write comments back about what we liked, what we didn't like. And then they would iterate on that, push a new version out, sometimes fairly quickly, within a few months. So they got to a point in MVC where they needed a DOM tree navigator, as you do. And they started writing their own, as Microsoft does. And the community said, look, what are you doing? This is a solved problem. Just use jQuery. And they did. Now, in 2010, they put jQuery in the box. To this day, you can use one of your Microsoft tech support tickets to get support for jQuery. It's strange, right? But it also represented this is the company was moving. Not only were they building stuff in their own open source world with their own coding approaches, but they were starting to incorporate others. And so putting jQuery in the box, to me, seems like an absolute breakthrough step for Microsoft in this recognition that open source is just a part of the way we build software now, that it's becoming table stakes. It's not there yet for Microsoft. It'll be years. But in 2010, they really set an anchor in the ground. They also, this is right at about this time, is when Steve Jobs puts out thoughts on Flash. It was an open letter. He said, look, Flash is bad. Now, what he was really upset about was that Flash was murdering the battery on his iPad, as it does. You could run it on a different browser and you could see just the battery would drain. But it also was a security risk. The plugin in general was a security risk. And if you were a developer back then, which means you provided IT to your family, you knew perfectly well every machine that your family had, the address bar had been replaced by something. Right? You didn't know what, but it was something, right? And getting rid of the plugin really did stop that. But it's also the death knell for Silverlight, because Silverlight depends on a plugin. Nobody's talking about that. That same month, Google announces AngularJS. They only called it Angular back then. So Angular was an internal project at Google that people were starting to figure out existed. They were trying to figure out how some of the ways that Gmail and some of these other Google apps worked in the browser. They were astonishing for their time. And so they were looking at the code inside of the pages, thinking, how does this work? Like, what is this? And this was an internal library that they were using extensively, to the point where the team that had written it, Mishek and his boys, were going to inside of Google saying, you should use this. And finally, a VP stops them and says, listen, if it's really that good, why isn't it available to the public? And so in the fall of 2010, they made a public version of it. And this was not the first SPA, but this is what kicks single-page applications into high gear. That this idea that the browser is a host for an app that still behaves like an app. Now, if you went through this time and you jumped on right now, you're about to get punished in about another year and a half or so as they figure out, oh, people really like this, we should change everything. But, that's the beginning of all of this. And this multi-form factor, whatever screen resolutions we want to work in, we have to be able to work in. And by 2013, we're talking about the year of responsive design. And if you were paying attention to the Silverlight thing at the time, It was at the PDC in 2010 where there were no Silverlight sessions. Like in April of 2010, Silverlight was the marquee product. And then here we are in October of 2010, and it's not at a Microsoft conference. And a reporter and friend of mine named Mary Jo Foley asked the president of Server and Tools, a guy named Bob Buglia, hey, where was Silverlight? And he said, our strategy has shifted. And to MJ's quote, credit, all she said, she just published what he said. Everybody else said, Silverlight is dead. And Silverlight was, well, seriously wounded at that point. I mean, the reality was, with the thoughts on Flash, it wasn't going to run on iOS. So the cross-platform story was over. But nobody at Microsoft had told anybody externally, essentially. They knew internally, but they were all locked down, focused on Windows 8 at this point, and they were not talking publicly. And so we were kind of left in the dark. Now, the action at Microsoft at the time, by 2011, when this is all happening, is in the browser space. This is when IE9 is in their betas, and they're shipping every few weeks. They're pushing new features out, and you could grab the beta bits over and over again. And Firefox is doing the same thing, and so is the Chrome team. And every time they come up with a really great feature, they send each other cakes. It was cool. It was a co-opetition. They're all pushing this, trying to push the standards forward. This is when the GPU gets harnessed into HTML5, and when we get pre-compilation, like browsers become dramatically faster. Now, we'll quickly compensate by that by making web pages way bigger, but this actually sets the foundation for Node becoming proof of JavaScript living outside of the browser. Now, Node's been around for a few years at this point, but it's in 2011 with the V8 runtime, with Google's really fast Java engine, the JavaScript engine, that it makes sense to go further with Node and to start thinking about the other way to do web development. Because up until things like Node came along, we were still in that academic internet world where your back end, whether it was IIS or Apache, was like a Swiss Army knife with every blade out. Everything is on, whatever you want to do, we can do, right? I mean, Apache is not named for the Indian tribe in America. It's literally a Apache server. You download the base runtime, and then you just start loading patches, right? Like, you may have been frustrated with IIS. Talk to a Linux guy about setting up Apache. Like, it's a thing. But it was a philosophical difference. It was this idea of all the services available with a huge attack surface. And the internet's getting less friendly. And along comes Node that says, everything is off. I do nothing. Now tell me what you want. And you've got to, one service at a time, stand up the tooling. Now, eventually we'll build templates and so forth, make it just as vulnerable as everything else. But initially, the mindset of, hey, why don't we start with all the blades closed and just pull out the ones we need, represents some growth and some evolution in taking JavaScript seriously. And the same for the ECMA specifications. By 2011, after the battles with the W3C for trying to figure out what HTML5 is really going to be about, we get initially what's called ES5, but then becomes 5.1. And we align JavaScript implementations across the major browsers with the ECMA specification, largely for the first time ever. Again, it feels like a moment when we grew up and said, okay, we're going to have a standards body, we're going to progress. It'll take a few years from here. This is like the gathering of folks saying, okay, we're going to be nice to each other. It'll be a few years before they're actually nice to each other. But we're on that process, on that step. And then Microsoft does the Build conference. This is the first Build. It's in 2011. It's in Anaheim. And it's where they announce Windows 8. Remember, I make a show called .NET Rocks. So I've been to PDC in 2010 when there was no Silverlight content, and that was worrying. Now I'm at the new developers conference in 2011. There's no .NET content. And I say to Carl as we're walking out of the building, what if .NET doesn't rock? And we were trying to figure out what to do with tablet content in general at that time, right? How do you talk about tablet development, considering how diverse it was? That's why we made the tablet show. It was sort of our backup strategy. Now, .NET will eventually rock again, but on that day was not an easy day. Now, you can understand where Microsoft was at. They were trying to respond to the tablet. They saw the tablet as an existential threat. They were wrong, but they thought that. But they also saw that they needed a lingua franca. They needed to speak the language that was going to run on all the platforms, and that was going to have to be JavaScript. And so their big concern now was you couldn't program Windows with JavaScript. So they made WinJS. Now look, the 3 guys who used it thought it was great. Okay? But they were trying to do a nearly impossible thing by making something that is JavaScript-ish, but most JavaScript people wouldn't even touch it. The Roslyn project is underway at this time, although it wasn't publicly visible. It was starting to be talked about. What they did was they pushed it over to Codeplex. So Roslyn was an effort to write C# in C#. Now, this is a normal thing for programming languages to do. It's kind of a metric of you're a mature language and you can build a compiler for yourself in yourself. I know it's recursive and weird, but that's how people who make languages think is fun, right? That's what they like to do. I'm not a real boy until I've written my compiler in my own language. But they didn't get to it. Remember, this language is now 10 years old. And it had been too successful in some respects. But they finally have an incentive to do it. And it really came out of Studio 2010. Because we had such good IntelliSense in Studio 2010 that as you were writing your C# code, it was telling you how you were doing it wrong. And the way it did that was with a real-time compiler, essentially, that was watching you write your code and making sure it was correct, which was not the same compiler as the one you used when you actually compiled your code. That was a compiler written in C++. And when those two didn't sync up, everybody was unhappy. And so there was this recognition of it's just costing us too much to maintain these two kinds of compilers. We need one. We need a compiler as a service. That's Roslyn. And it was written in C#. And I think arguably the most important thing that Roslyn did for us out in the world was make a whole bunch of C# developers inside of Microsoft. Because before Roslyn, they were all C++ developers. They still are. But they write a lot of C# today. And it's one of the reasons I think C# had this transformation as Roslyn came into play and all of this thinking around C# grew. And we did shows on this, actually we did them here. We were talking to folks like Mads Torgensen about, I called it the Cambrian explosion of C#. Like this redesign in the way you're approaching it allows us to evolve the language way more efficiently based on people who are really using it. So that's good news on the .NET world. At the same time, .NET's largely been ignored by Windows because it doesn't run on the phones. But don't worry, Saint Diacaza is coming. Miguel, now somewhat older, 10 years on, he's in his late 30s at this point, has been quietly working away on the Mono project. And in fact, when the iPhone came out, built a cross-compiler for Mono onto the iPhone. He called it Mono Touch. And by 2011, he's got it running on Android as well. And that's when Novell gets bought by Attachmate and shuts down the Mono project. So Miguel calls up his friend Nat Friedman and says, we got to give it a home to this cool project, this new, building using C# to write mobile apps. Like, we got to do something. And they make a company called Xamarin. They ultimately convince Attachmate to ship all the assets to them. That's where Xamarin comes from, is that it's the pulling all that stuff together and focusing on the mobile development story. It's got problems, as you likely know if you worked on it back then. But it's an extraordinary goal. And I remember at the time saying, hey, maybe the person who really believes in C# this day doesn't work at Microsoft. In fact, he works at a new company called Xamarin, because he was making C# do things that Microsoft said they couldn't do. We get the first version of Bootstrap, which is a way for all of us web folks to not think about CSS anymore. Moving on. Our friend Anders Hallsberg. That's the other thing that happened in 2011. As if 2010 wasn't dark enough, that's also when Anders steps away from C#. Now, he doesn't really step away. He puts Mads in charge. He wants to work on other things. And what he's working on is this. His question was, can we make JavaScript more reliable? And the whole idea that we had, CoffeeScript was already around. Like, there were pre-compilers for JavaScript already. He thought he could make a better one, and he was right. But more importantly, he did the entire thing on Codeplex as an open source project. Now, there was a firm belief inside of Microsoft at that time that Microsoft is never going to do well in open source as possible. We can do our own thing, but the open source community does not like Microsoft. They want everything to do with Microsoft, and then TypeScript. Because the open source community loved TypeScript. And all sorts of contributions came from all kinds of places. Because of the way they did the extensions, where you basically didn't need Microsoft permission to write an extension, people wrote extensions. And it was a lightning bolt through Microsoft. It says, hey, when you make good things that actually help people, the open source community will use them. By 2012, hardware is a little bit sexier. You can see the Dell is only large enough to kill a small animal rather than a large animal. It's because at the same time, the Air has just come out, and now you have a laptop so thin you can slice cheese with it. And all the phones look the same. The Galaxy is the top Android phone. The iPhone 5 is the top iPhone. Phones are now boring. And so Microsoft says the only thing they can do, gives themselves a new logo. I mean, this has been the logo ever since, but 2012, that's when it happened. But Microsoft is transforming at this point, right? Like the forces are at work. They create a wholly owned subsidiary called OpenTech. And OpenTech's job is to make sure that open source products run on all the .NET stuff. So Memcached, all of those things, they have good .NET clients. And we get Studio 2012. Most of the version you remember for uppercase menu, which we all hated. We agreed on that. It also supported ARM processors, which was kind of important, but we don't think a lot about that. And by build 2012, we have Win 8, we have Studio 2012, and the vast majority of the apps for Win 8 are written in C# and XAML, so much for Win.js. All right, I'm going to go through the last of this quickly because now we're getting into modern times, and I hope you had fun with that first decade because a lot of people don't know it. Because there are amazing transformative things that happen after this. Win 8's going to go away. We're going to focus on the new Microsoft that's going to transform by 2014. AI has one of the most significant breakthroughs, the modern breakthrough, in 2012. This guy named Geoffrey Hinton out of the University of Toronto, who'd been involved in AI from way before it was sexy, going back to the 70s and 80s, done all the original neural net stuff, and he'd written these papers about backpropagation and said the computing just can't handle it. Well, in 2011, his graduate students grab onto that technology, start working on it, and they put it into the ImageNet recognition challenge. So this has been running for a few years. This was 14 million identified images. So it said what was on them, and they were using decision trees, and they were getting about 70% success rate. The first attempt by Hinton's team in 2012 using the adversarial neural nets, 95%. The next year, it's 100%. This is the AI revolution. This is when it happens, the beginning of it. All of the other stuff you see from here comes from this new neural net model using GPUs. Docker comes out with containers. Containers have been around for years right now. They will come up with a standard based on Linux that will take over the market, and they'll never make a penny on it. That's a shame. React comes down from the Facebook folks at JSConf as another SPA. Views will fall shortly after. This is sort of the consolidation of web development in the different SPA frameworks, which is very powerful. And then in 2014, we have the revolution of Microsoft. This is when Satya Nadella is now the CEO. They opened the show at the keynote by saying, if you want to run Windows on a device with a screen 9 inches or smaller, Windows is free. Right? They've had 30 years of Windows as the center of the company, and they open their new show with Windows is free for small form factors because they're becoming a cloud company. That's what their focus is. And you can tell because they rename Azure from Windows Azure to Microsoft Azure. Their goal is to sell compute, which means they don't care what operating system you run on. They want you to run on anything. Whatever you want to run on, it's good enough for them. The HTML specification finally gets ratified, and it is awesome. The Amazon Echo comes out because we were not being spied on enough. This is also voice recognition. You never trained this device. It worked with anybody's voice, unless you were Australian. But everybody else, it was fine. But it was just, again, part of this evolution of AI technologies. Microsoft makes their next hit in the open source space with Visual Studio Code. Now, this time they believed they could do it. Can we make the best editor? And within 5 years, it will be the #1 editor. But they went in with that intent. What does the world need from an editor? What can we take from what we've learned in our Windows-centric world that can be applied to everyone? That's Visual Studio Code. They also put out Edge, so not everything they do is brilliant. But they'll fix it eventually. And we get the progressive web app. So this was a specification from the Google guys, and it was really how do we extend the SPA into being more app-like with a manifest and different rules. It hasn't gone necessarily where it wanted to go, but it's an interesting part of the progression. ECMA specification 6, which they quickly renamed to 2015 because numbers are hard. But I mean, this is when they're now on the track. By 2015, we've had a version of ECMA every year. We still have to wait for the browsers to implement it, but largely the browser folks are on those teams, and they're helping to decide new features. We have a growing and evolving language. We need to manage our containers, and we come up with Kubernetes. Why did Kubernetes win? Because for a while there were lots of orchestrators. This is one that was built by Brendan Burns working for Google, which is fine. It was open source. It had its features. It had its strengths and weaknesses. But then Brendan Burns goes to Microsoft in 2016. And now Microsoft quickly does an implementation of Kubernetes that runs on Azure well, the AKS. And Amazon looks at it and goes, holy cow, and they do an implementation as well. And now there's one orchestration engine that runs on all 3 of the big cloud platforms and on premises. And so in a way, we create a monopoly that doesn't seem to be quite as toxic as most monopolies, right? Kubernetes has essentially dominated this space for better or worse. It's still an open source project that has contributors from multiple places. All the major platforms run it, and you can run it yourself. It's now, because it's gotten as large as it is, has a decent ecosystem around it with tools like Helm and a host of others. Like this is, I think, is a very significant innovation for development, that we can agree on one way to do something, more or less, one set of tools, if we do it in an open way. And we do it in a way where no one vendor has control over it, and no pricing on it. That being said, did Google take away Brendan's check-in rights when he went over to Microsoft? Like now there's an interesting game between these check giants for who owns those repositories. You know, because now Microsoft's going to start implementing Chromium, like how's those contributions working? Microsoft does eventually buy Xamarin in 2016. We did shows around that, and Miguel and Nat joined Microsoft. Nat will go on to become the CEO of GitHub when they acquire that. And Microsoft decides to completely rewrite .NET because they wanted an open source, cross-platform, cloud-centric version of .NET. And .NET up until now had been built to run on Windows. And disentangling it from that was impossible. It was easier to start over, which is extraordinary if you think about it. You know, at this point, it's 15 years old, and they're going to start over. And Steve Sanders is around here somewhere, but at the NDC conference in Oslo back in 2017, he took an open source version of C#, rammed it through, that could compile through LTTM into WebAssembly, and showed us what would eventually become Blazor, and blew all our minds. That's got a lot of evolving to go, but you know, it's extraordinary what it represented at the time, and it's still moving that way. By 2017, hardware is generally looking sexy now. I mean, the clean silver box, it is a tower PC. The iMac has run out of ideas, so now it used to be silver, now it's black. But it has 32 cores, because that's a good idea. And yeah, I mean, you can now get an iPhone in rose gold. So that's the evolution of civilization right there. Codeplex becomes an archive in 2017, because Microsoft has moved everything to GitHub. And GitHub will be their central focus, ultimately culminating them owning GitHub because they need to. Their whole company runs on it, for better or worse. But I'll throw in a little more AI conversation. You remember AlphaGo? So back in the 90s, IBM with Deep Blue beat chess with a decision tree engine. But Go was considered impossible for a decision tree engine. And so the group at DeepMind spent a couple of years building a neural net model to play Go. And by 2017, it beat the best Go player in the world. That was AlphaGo. They then, in the same year, re-engineered it into a self-training model called AlphaZero. So rather than having it look at games and how games were played, just know the rules and play yourself. So it took them 2 years to train the original model. AlphaZero trained to beat AlphaGo in 30 days. Microsoft acquires GitHub. For the most part, nobody minds. Just means they don't have to make money anymore. All we really notice is we paid less. .NET Core grows up. Version 3 is the point where they start making SDKs for UX libraries. This is when we get WinForms into .NET Core. It's just a different version of WinForms. You have to make some changes to move across to it, but it's compelling. The Edge browser gets fixed by running the Chromium engine, which is an interesting loop. That now Microsoft's contributing to an open source library for their competitors' browser they're using in their own browser. And it's fun to see them fight back and forth in that one. There is some oddities going on there. But for us in the development space, we're witnessing all of that. And we're down to almost current times now. GPT-3, this generative pre-trained transformer, basically ability to read and understand text and do stuff with it. And if you play with it at all, you've seen things like the OpenAI Codex, where I can basically describe a game, and through GPT-3, it'll turn that into code for me. But I would talk about, I think the single most impactful thing that's happened, it comes from those DeepMind folks. It's AlphaFold 2. I don't know if you've followed this. So you remember the same initiative I talked about with ImageNet and how they took 14 million images and made a Becker recognizer for it? So protein folding is one of the most complex aspects of biological science going on right now. We barely understand it ourselves. And the folks at DeepMind have now taken the models that played Go and applied it to protein folding. And just last year, or 2020, the AlphaFold 2 was able to recognize protein folding formats more advanced than anything we'd figured out ourselves. Most of the time with AI models, machine learning models, they're doing things we could do ourselves, they'll do it automatically and cheaply. This is one of the very few examples we've had so far of it's doing something we can't do. It's getting a 90% accuracy at recognizing behavior in protein folds that have never been shown before. They're still struggling to validate all of the data it's produced. But this is a step forward in how AI models can work to solve effectively what we're now seeing as unsolvable problems. The cloud is a vital part of that. It takes a huge amount of compute to build these models, not that much to run it, so it makes sense to have cloud to be able to harness all that compute, run the model, and try it. But we're starting to solve uniquely complex problems with this technology. And then we also have GitHub Copilot, because Microsoft's taken everything that's in GitHub that's publicly visible and fed it through that same engine. And now if you play with this and you start writing code, it's going to take what your code looks like and help finish it for you based on what others have done on GitHub, even if it's a bad idea. But that's where that comes from, right? This is that same model, GPT-3, and just having access to a tremendous amount of data, whether that's image data, whether that's protein folding data, or whether that's code. We take these models and we apply to them and we can amplify them. It's just a tool for us. It gives us the ability to write code faster. Hopefully it'll actually be useful, but eventually we'll just call it IntelliCode. Right now it's Copilot. And last year we got .NET 6, kind of the consolidating versions of .NET. .NET 7 comes in this November. They're on an annual cadence now. 6 is the long-term support version, which these days means 3 years, because it's in our best interest to keep our code compilable one way or the other. It's how we've evolved. That's what 20 years has done for us. I don't know what's next. All I know is I've been really enjoying the ride, and I hope you have too. Have a great day. Thank you so much for coming out.